Hello, everybody. How's everybody doing today? So I think there's probably going to be about a 10-second or so delay before I say something and you hear it. So just to make sure that everybody is hearing me through the microphone and you're seeing me on the screen, just drop something in the chat. So I'll wait about 10 seconds for that to come in, I'm sure. Cool. Cool. So it looks like everybody is seeing and hearing me. So I'm just going to go straight over to sharing Ableton. So you all should be able to see that screen at the moment. Right, let's get straight to it. Cool. So what we're going to be talking about today is not the most glamorous of subjects, but it's something that's still really important when you're working with Ableton, and that's kind of getting organized. Most of this session, we're probably going to be talking about kind of file organization and how file organization works in Live and how to sort of work in the browser. A lot of people often ask me how I set up collections and how you can kind of work with that. So we're not really going to be doing much music making today, just mostly kind of getting organized and talking about workflow and how getting organized is kind of an important part of your workflow. Cool. So question that's already come in is, will it be recorded? Will this live stream be recorded? Is yes, it is. So it's streaming to YouTube, so you should be able to watch it after the fact. Yeah, and then there will be some time for questions at the end. So feel free to post your questions throughout, but I'll also, once I'm done, I'll let you know, and you can kind of ask some questions as well, and we can just spend some time going through questions. Cool. So the first thing to do is to kind of understand how files work in Ableton Live. So if I load up a sample, I've just got a drum loop here, and I load that up. Whenever you load a sample into Ableton, that sample doesn't get copied into Live. It's referenced at the original location on disk. And this is really important to know, this idea about referencing. So obviously I can play this sample, and that's all good and well. But this sample here hasn't actually been copied into the Live set. It's being referenced in this location and at this name. So, and this is something that I'm sure many of you have run into before, that horrible orange bar that you get at the bottom when a file is missing. If something happens to this file that, let's say even something as simple as the name gets changed, I'm just going to add an X on the end there. If I were to save this set, let's save it to desktop just as test, and close it and reopen Live, I'm sure you already all know what's going to happen. I'm going to pop up and get the big old orange bar that says media files are missing, and I can't hear that. Now I can obviously relink this file. I can click here and I can find that file on disk just using search, or if you know exactly where that file is, you can actually just drag and drop it in there and Live will automatically link it. But even though I've relinked it, and I should be able to listen to this now, Live is still referencing that file on disk in this particular folder on my hard drive. So again, if I were to rename it or move it somewhere else, that link is going to be broken. So that's kind of quite an important thing to just remember as we go through some file organization stuff in Live, that's kind of how samples work and how sort of various other files work as well. So this also holds true for Max for Live files, .amxd files. And we'll talk about the different kinds of file types that exist in Live at some point as well. But obviously we've got samples, we've got AMXD files, files like ADG, etc. Cool, so just bear that in mind as we go through everything about how files work in Live. So heading over to the browser, the main area that we're going to spend most of the time in today is this place called the user library. You may have seen it sitting there, you may already be using it, you may not be using it. What I'm going to walk you through is kind of what I think is the best way of organizing your files in Live. And this mostly relates to sort of preset files, max files, instruments and things that work with samples as well. There's always a number of different ways to do things, and there's a number of different ways that you can organize files in Live, but the user library is quite good for a number of reasons. And this is also going to lead us on to collections and seeing how you can work with collections. So the user library is specifically set up as a place for you to kind of save your content to. Now, just to point out that you can actually use a custom folder anywhere on your hard drive to store and work with files. So for example, if I go add folder, and I actually just I'm going to add this whole improve your workflow folder in there so I can access stuff from there. So here that is, and I can load things from here. I can load samples, I can load racks, I can load Max devices directly from there, which is kind of all good and well. One sort of annoyance that you'll immediately start to notice with files saved outside of the user library is anytime you're working with something that has samples. So for example, all of these here have some kind of samples with them. So this is like an 808 drum kit that has samples. You get this folder because it needs to store those samples somewhere. So going back to what I mentioned at the beginning, that the samples are always referenced on disk. This is the case as well for any instruments or racks or drum racks and things like that work with samples as well. It's got to know where those samples are saved on the disk. And if you save this rack outside of the user library, Ableton will collect those samples into a folder. It's actually an Ableton project folder, just like any other project folder. And it'll collect them in there so it knows where to always reference those. So you'll actually see that if I add another folder, let's just add in here, set up this blank folder called My Files. And I'm going to save this 808 rack with these samples into that. So I just drag and drop it in there. And you'll see how it's saved the ADG file, but it's automatically created this 808 project folder. So if I hit enter, it's going to copy all those samples in there and automatically create a samples folder for me. There's actually a preference in Live's preferences that is relevant to this. So if I open this up and go to file folder, I believe it is. No, maybe it's library. Yep, in library. You'll see there's this option here for browser behavior, collect files on export. By default, I believe this is set to always. And that behavior that you just saw, where when I saved something into this folder and collected those samples, that's because it's set to always. It'll collect those files. But you can change that if you want so that it'll ask you, depending on, there's certain situations where maybe you kind of have certain samples that you know always stay in a particular situation, particular place on your hard drive, and you're saving racks and things that reference those that maybe you don't want to collect those samples. So you can set to ask, or you could set to never if you want. Just to be safe, I kind of always leave mine on always. And so when you save something outside of the user library, it collects it into these folders like this, which becomes a bit annoying for kind of organizing things, because anytime you want to access one of these, you've got to dig into these folders and multiple kind of layers to access stuff. So going over to the user library, if you've never used the user library before, you'll see in here, in fact, before I do that, I'm just going to make sure that everything's looking good. Check out the chat. Seems like everything's all good there. So the user library, if you've never used the user library before, there'll already be a bunch of folders in here by default. And it's important that you don't delete or change those, because those are actually system folders. Things like clips, defaults, grooves, preset samples, and templates will all be in there by default. So you might have sort of already come across some of these things when you're saving certain files. So for example, if I load up an effect, like let's just load up EQ8, and I hit this save button here, that actually saves into my user library. Now, this is slightly different, so let me just change this. Let me delete this, and I'll load something from the default Ableton effects here. Let's just do delay. If I hit save, I make a custom preset, make some changes to this, and I hit save. It saves it into the user library, but it saves it in this presets folder, and it saves it into like various different subfolders within the effect subfolder, within the audio effects, within presets, etc. So if I save that, it's a bit of a pain to try and kind of always access that. I've got to go in and I've got to know that I've got a delay preset saved. So to be honest, I'm not a huge fan of this presets folder, and I don't really use it very much to save things. Instead, what I'd recommend doing is inside the user library, you can actually, this is basically just a folder on your hard drive. If I right click, I say show and find, or show and explorer if you're on Windows. It's just a folder that you can organize, and you can create subfolders in here kind of as you need them. So what I'd recommend doing is creating a new folder in here and call it whatever you want to call it. My sounds, you'll see I've actually got one set up here already called Studio. And this is where you're going to start to organize all your own custom sounds, presets that you save. You'll see how you can save sort of VST plugins and things in here as well. And one of the great things about the user library, you'll notice that I don't have my categories visible because I actually never go into here to find things. Because using the user library, you can kind of arbitrarily collect different things together. You can have VST plugins and live effects and Max for live devices all in the same folder. So it makes things a little bit easier for kind of getting organized instead of having to dig through all these different categories. Saves you a bit of space in the browser as well. So to save something into a folder that you've created in the user library, the easiest way to do that is literally just drag and drop it straight into that folder. And you can obviously call this whatever you want to call it, my delay, etc. And that's it. That's kind of the basics. Is if I want to save something else into this, let's go over to this 808 rack, I just drag and drop into that same folder. Now, you'll notice something a little different when I drop this in here. If I hit enter, notice how it's still copying the samples, because there are these samples associated with this 808 rack, but it hasn't created a folder. So inside the user library, there's this samples folder, and anything that you save into the user library that needs an external file, so a sample or a Max for live device basically, gets collected into this samples folder. So there's a whole bunch of stuff in here already from various presets that I've saved. And I'll show you in a bit kind of a way that you can manage this and sort of get rid of unused samples or find samples that are missing and fix stuff in the user library. But immediately that's a lot better than saving things outside of the user library because I don't have to deal with that kind of annoying folder structure. I can just have this at the top level, makes it a lot easier to organize stuff. But beyond this, I can just kind of go nuts with how I want to organize this. If I create a new folder maybe for sounds and somehow created two folders in one there, it's kind of interesting. Oh, there we go. New folder for effects, let's say. And I can just move things around and organize them as I see fit. You can also save basically anything to the user library. And you might not actually be aware of this, but pretty much anything that you can drag and move around in live, you can actually save. So this clip here, I can save that into the user library. It'll save it as a live clip, which is a special kind of format. If I've got this track set up and maybe I have a bunch of effects and things, and this is maybe like for mixing, I always have an EQ and a compressor on a track, and I want to save this particular configuration of an audio track, I can actually drag that whole thing into a folder to save it. So if you've got like preset kind of tracks that you want to drag in, you can save entire sessions in here, you can save groups. So basically anything that you can drag around in live, you can pretty much save into the user library or into any other folder really. And so I can access the tracks within that, which is pretty cool. So in terms of organizing these, this is kind of really up to you how you go about organizing those and setting up your own folder structure. But I'll give you an idea of sort of where you can go with this. So this is what I've called my studio folder. I like to think of this as like my virtual studio. And I've just set up folders kind of based on what I need. And you'll see in a moment how these sort of relate to the collections as well. So like effects. And now immediately you'll start to see kind of one use of using the user library in this kind of custom organization for yourself is, I know recently in Live 11, they've kind of added categories to the audio effects in here. But with the user library, you can sort of set these up pretty arbitrarily to be absolutely anything you want. So for example, for my effects, instead of just having like all my effects in one long list, I can organize these by the kinds of effects that I want. So for example, color. And you'll notice in here, I've got VSTs, I've got Max for live devices. This is a Max for live device. I've got native devices with sort of custom configurations. So you'll see how you can really easily mix and match these things. And saving any of these is pretty much the same as anything else in live. Just drag and drop it. So let's load up, actually just as an example, let's load up a Max for live device. And let's load up a plugin. Now, the only caveat to this with plugins is that you can only directly save VST3 and audio unit plugins. The VST2 plugins you can actually save, but there's a workaround, which I'll show you in a moment. So just going back to this other folder I set up here, this is a Max for live device. Just drag and drop it in there, hit enter. You would have seen that Ableton sort of quickly copied the Max for Live device, the file that's associated with that. VST plugin, drag it in there, hit enter, saves it as whatever you've got that configured as. And of course, you could have multiple configurations. I've got this delay set up in a particular way, but I could change it around and save this as other delay, whatever I want. So it's super, super flexible how you can set these up. So the way I saved this VST3 plugin is the same as the way you save an audio unit plugin. Just to show you, I don't know if I've actually got any VST2 plugins. I do. Let's just load one of these up so you can see what that looks like in terms of saving. So if I try to drag this to the user library, no dice, that's not going to work. So how you can save if you're still working with VST2 plugins, the way you save this is you have to group it. So just Command G groups it into a rack. And you can obviously name that rack whatever you want. So like little plate, you add macros, do whatever you need. And then you can save that like that. So that's how you can save VST2 plugins as well. So but basically anything can be saved into these folders. So going back to Studio, so I've got my effects and I can set them up in all these sort of various different folders. I've got like an Explore folder, which is new things that I haven't quite used yet, and I want to just try those out and play around with them a bit. Grooves, if I save custom grooves. MIDI effects. Again, these can come from the MIDI effects category, Max for Live devices. Percussions, various drum machines, things that have samples. So like these all have samples. And again, you can create kind of folders within folders, which is pretty cool. And then sounds, which is like instruments and things like that. So from here, this is where you start to get into working with the collections. So you may know you've got 7 collections available to you in Live, and you can rename these to be whatever you want. I've just happened to sort of work out 7 that kind of neatly work for me, which is cool. And the way this works is anything anywhere in Live's browser, you can right-click on it and add it to a collection. So essentially what I've done is with these folders in here, I've just added these all to my effects collection. So instead of actually having to even dig into the user library, if I'm working in Live, I'm just worried about these top levels of things that I can work with. So I go into my effects, there's all my effects that I want to access. I've got my MIDI devices, they're all right there. I've got sounds, and again, I can organize those into folders. So people have often asked me, how do I get folders inside my collections? And that's exactly this method. So if you're using the user library and you're creating folders in there, you can add those folders to a collection, and then they show up there, and you can have folders within folders, etc. Because this is just all folders on the drive. And so this is totally up to you how you organize these, but you'll even see like you can add packs in here as well. You can kind of mix and match with the collections. So for example, packs, like here I've just got a couple of the new packs for Live 11 that I haven't really explored yet. I can add those to a collection as well, and also mix and match with things that are, so some of these are in the user library, some of these are packs. So even if I have stuff that's saved outside of the user library, I can still reference those. Because like at the moment, there might only be some sounds in here, and so I'll save those to the user library, but I don't want to save the whole pack to the user library just yet. So I can tag the whole pack and it'll show up in this Explore category. But that's kind of the basics of setting up the user library and then working with your collections. And it's totally up to you how you go about setting those up. Cool. So a couple other things that are important to just discuss. I mentioned talking about the different file types that exist. So there are 4 main file types that you'll kind of come across, ignoring presets, like VST presets and audio unit presets. You'll see like even here, I can mix and match audio units and VSTs, which is pretty cool. So the first kind of file you'll come across is Max for Live devices, which is an AMXD file. So if you are using Ableton Live Suite or Ableton Live Standard with Max for Live, and you've ever downloaded a Max for Live file from, say, like maxforlive.com, you get this .amxd file. And all you do to install it is you can actually just drag and drop this into Live and then save it, again, just by dragging and dropping into your, oops, let's save it in here, into your user library, and that'll save it. You'll notice that when you save to the user library, it doesn't actually save it as a .amxd file. It saves it as a .adv file. So this is an Ableton device, I think. I honestly don't actually know what the ADV stands for, but I'm guessing it's Ableton device. Because anytime you save just a straight up device by itself, so like basically saving a preset of a device, so you'll see these delays, you get .adv files. And those don't actually reference any external files because you haven't got any samples or anything in there that you're working with. So those are pretty easy. You can just kind of save them there. Also, if I right click on this and I say show this in Finder, these are really easy to work with because I can just copy the ADV file and share that with someone else, and they can just load that straight into Live and it'll work. It's a little bit trickier with Max for Live devices because this now doesn't actually have the associated Max device with it. If I wanted to save this Max device to be able to share with someone, I then need to actually either find the original Max patcher, which you can always do by right-clicking and just saying locate patcher, and there it is, and then I can show that in the Finder. Or if you want to save something outside of the user library to distribute to someone else, like a Max for Live device, you can, if you drag and drop it into now a folder that's outside, you'll see it creates this folder and it copies the relevant Max device inside there, which is quite handy if you wanted to share like preset files with people. So ADV files. Then we've also got, do I have any in here? ADG, there we go. So ADG, I'm guessing stands for Ableton Device Group, because that's basically a rack. Anytime you've got multiple devices saved inside of something, it becomes an ADG file. And there's two kinds of ADG files that you'll sort of interact with. There's ones that just have Ableton devices, so they have no external samples, no Max for Live devices. Those are pretty straightforward because you'll see I can just save this into a folder in outside of Live. I can save it into the user library, literally just saves it as an ADG file. Something like this 808 though, this is actually also an ADG file, but this is an ADG file that references external samples. So there could be a Max for Live device, could be samples like WAV files, etc. And when you save that, as we saw over here, it also creates an ADG file, but it'll create that folder for you. If you save it outside of the user library, if you save it inside the user library, then it just saves. I've actually already got that in sounds, I think. Yeah, it just saves the ADG file and the samples get saved into the samples folder in the user library. So those are the different kinds of files that you'll work with in Live, and it's useful just to know about those and kind of know how they work. So I've just glanced down and seen a question here, which I'll address now. Is how is this custom folder different from collections, the user library? I assume you're asking about this sort of studio folder. The answer is that you get a lot more flexibility in terms of how you create your own folder structures. So if I was just working with collections, let's say I wanted to let's say as an example, I wanted to have folders inside the effects here. I couldn't do that with, if I just went into audio effects and added like delay to that, it'll show up in there. There's the delay, but I can't really put that inside additional folders. So using the user library and saving kind of custom presets this way is just really a way for you to have a more kind of customizable folder structure where you can have folders inside folders within the collections, because you really only have 7 collections. If you had maybe like an unlimited number of collections, that might be a bit different. But so yeah, using this custom sort of setup in the user library is how you can get really additional folders and essentially set up your own kind of file structure, how you want to work with it. You don't even really need to use the collections. You could just have one collection that is My Studio that just links straight to this, and then you completely set up your own custom folder structure within that if you want. This is just kind of the way I've set it up. So just to point out as well, there's no right or wrong way of doing this. This is just the way that I've set it up. And hopefully what I'm showing you is just the way that this works and the way the different, because I spent a lot of time sort of figuring out the way the different files interact and how saving things in certain locations works. So hopefully it just gives you an idea of how that works, and then you can build your own custom setup with that. Cool. So another really important thing to be aware of is the Manage Files dialog. So you may have never even used this before. Hopefully everyone's heard of collect all and save, but I'll just go over it quickly if we've got some beginners here. So right in the beginning of the stream, I sort of went through how files, external files work in Live, and I loaded in this sample and then changed the name, and you would have seen how the sample became unlinked. So I'm sure you've all experienced that before. If a sample has been moved to a different location and it becomes unlinked, then it's a bit of a pain. So what you can do is when you save a live set, so in fact I can show you because this file is not actually currently saved in this live set. It's still being referenced on disk. So if I maybe move this to an external hard drive or want to share it with someone, that file's not going to be there. So what collect all and save does is it lets you collect any externally referenced files into the project folder of Live. And I'll talk about project folders in a moment and how those work, because it's quite important to understand that as well. And so files from elsewhere is basically files from anywhere other than these other three locations. Files from other projects, so if you've got another Live project and you've loaded a sample or a Max for Live device from there, this is going to collect those. Files from the user library, and files from factory packs. So how you might set these up really depends on the situation you're going for. So like if you're just saving this to archive for yourself on your own computer, you might always have those files that you've used in the user library, and you know they're always going to be in that location, and same for factory packs. So you don't need to collect those. You maybe just need to collect a file that's on like an external hard drive, say. Then you would only do that. Because remember, every time you collect a file, what it actually does is it creates a copy of that file inside the project folder. And so you're going to kind of double up on storage space. If you were, say, sharing this project with someone else who's on a totally different computer, you probably want to select all of these because they might not have the same factory packs as you. They might not have the same sounds in their user library, etc. So this is one way to do it, and you hit OK, and it's going to save and collect those files. But I'll show you another way to do it, and this is kind of, to be honest, the preferred way to do it because you get a bit more visibility into what is going on. So if you go to File and Manage Files, this opens up this section here in the browser. There's three different levels: Manage Set, so this is the live set, and Manage Project and Manage User Library. First, let's maybe just talk about live projects. I'll go back to the Finder. And yeah, so if I go back to the desktop. So this is a really important thing to distinguish, and it's a problem or an issue I see a lot of beginners having with Live, is you'll notice when you save a project, so I saved this test project, it gets stuck in a folder, and then inside that folder you have this .als file. So what I see a lot of beginners doing is if they want to move something around or move it to a different location, they just move this .als file and they move it outside of this project folder. It's really important that you don't do that, that you always keep this ALS file and any other folders that you had created inside the project folder. And when you are archiving projects, sharing it with someone, moving things around, you always want to take this whole project folder because that has everything that is related to this project saved in it, including external samples once we collect them, which you'll see in a moment. So at the moment, there's no samples in here. Back in Live, I'm going to go over to Manage Project because I want to manage the whole project. Because remember, I might have multiple live sets in here because I could do like a save as and save this as test v2. And then I've got multiple projects or multiple sets, sorry. So I'm going to hit Manage Project and it's going to manage everything associated with that project folder. So why I say this is useful is because it gives you a lot of info about your project. You can see useful stuff like how much data is contained within it, etc. But the most important part is this area over here that says external files. This shows you anything that is currently not included in the project. So 2 files from elsewhere, I can hit show and I can see in the browser, this project has got Notepad, which I loaded at some point, and that sample. If I hit files from other project, hit show, that'll be all those 808 drum samples, which I loaded from this folder on the disk, which you'll see is actually another live project. So that's saying files from another project. Files from the user library, so that's this Max for Live device, which I loaded up as well. And then you've got all these options here to choose which ones you want to collect in. You'll also see it'll tell you if there's unused files. I'll show you how that works in a moment. But same way as before, which files you collect really depends on how you're going to be using this. So if I'm going to be sharing this with someone else, I'll probably want to collect all the files. But if it's just for my own purposes, maybe I don't collect the user library and I don't collect the other project, because that doesn't really matter to me. And I hit collect all and collect and save. And it's gonna think for a second and copy those samples. Cool, changes were saved successfully. If I now go back over to the Finder and go to that project folder, the test project, now you'll see there's a whole bunch more in there. There's a samples folder, and if I go into that samples folder, there's that drum loop. It's been collected in there. If I go into the presets folder, so like WAV files go into the samples folder, presets will be your Macs for Live devices. So there's Notepad. And notice it was just Notepad. It didn't collect that Mojo Macs for Live device, because remember, that was something that came from my user library. So again, just to reiterate, when you are moving this project around, don't move the individual ALS files. You need to move or save or archive or whatever it is, this entire project. So let's say I decide I don't need this drum loop, and I delete that. And I go into manage project. Cool. Now you'll see where it says unused files. So this is again where this sort of manage files dialog can be quite useful. So again, file, manage files, manage project. There you go. So unused files, I can see there's one file, 3.1 megabytes, and I can click on that, and it's that drum loop because I've now deleted it from that project. So remember, it's still saved in the project folder, so it's taking up space on my hard drive, but I'm not actually using it anymore. So if I want to get rid of it, I can just find it in that in the browser here, click on it, and just hit backspace to delete it or move it to the trash. Hasn't deleted the original sample, it's just deleted it from this samples folder. The original sample is unchanged because remember I collected it into the project, if that makes sense. So this is a really important kind of place to pay attention to, particularly if you don't need to worry about this all the time, but particularly if you're going to be archiving a set or sharing it with someone else, like if you're working with a collaborator, this is a really important step to check out. You can also use this to find missing files if there's something that's missing. So that's probably from one of the backup files in there. If I go back to the home though, you'll also see this manage files dialog. There's a place where you can manage the user library. So this is going to take a little bit longer to scan because I've got lots of files in there. Cool. So there's a bunch of, I've got quite a lot of files in my user library. You can see the size of it. I can see there's external files. So you'll see like I haven't actually collected the factory packs into my user library because I don't need to do that because I know what my factory pack's always going to be. But I can also use that if, let's say I delete a preset from my user library and it had some samples associated with it. So let's say I go into the user library and I go into my sounds, and for whatever reason, I'm like, oh, I don't really care about this 808 thing anymore. I delete that. It doesn't actually delete the samples. So that's important to be aware of because it's going to still be taking up space in your disk. But as soon as you do that, and there's no ADG file that's referencing those samples, Live will pick that up. It'll detect that there's samples that aren't being referenced by something, and they'll show up in this unused files. So mine are actually not the 808 ones because I've got another version of that 808 saved that's still referencing them. This is a bunch of files that I've saved in the user library that are not actually being used by anything. So that's something different, which is like a little bit more advanced. I'm not going to get into. But this will show you basically any samples that aren't being used, any Macs for Live devices that maybe aren't being used, like you installed a Macs for Live device and then decided you didn't need it anymore. You can go through and use that to save yourself some space. I mean, mine's not that big, 3.3 megabytes. So that's how you can manage the user library as well. I think you can also, no, I'm lying. I thought you could maybe click on that and get to it, but you can't. And that's kind of it for what I wanted to go through in terms of getting organized. Now, I know the name of this was something to do with getting organized and workflow, and there's a lot of other things that go into workflow as well, like working with shortcuts, using templates, all that sort of thing. which we can definitely chat about if there's questions about it. But that's kind of the main crux of what I wanted to go through, just because I've honestly never really seen anybody go through how the Ableton file system works in a lot of detail. And it's quite an important thing to actually understand and to avoid things like those missing samples, to make sure when you save stuff, it gets saved correctly and you always have those files and you're not running into issues, working with collaborators, etc. But if sort of more other workflow stuff is something you want to get into in this session, just ask some questions about it and we can dive into it. So, assuming that you're all a couple seconds behind, now's the time if you want to drop any questions in the chat. I'm just going to head over to the chat while I wait for questions to come through and see if there's any questions so far. Cool, Ben. So Ben's mind is blown about saving entire tracks into the user library. That's pretty handy, definitely is. Yeah, so I see Luis has said, I know I have a lot of work to do to get organized. That's something that this does just take a little bit of initial setup. So it did take me a while initially to kind of get my user library set up how I wanted and my collections and things like that. But once you've done it once, then it's kind of good to go. And it's really quick once you've got kind of the basic setup. If you get like a new effect or something that you want to save, it's pretty quick to save it into your user library. So I'm just going to kind of go back. What's the motivation for using collections as opposed to folders and places? Ben, so you maybe, I don't know if you missed, so Ben's question is, what's the motivation for using collections as opposed to folders and places? I don't know if you missed maybe the first bit of it before I got into things, but when you save something into a folder in places, like if I save this drum rack, it's mostly an issue for when you're working with something that has samples, because the way Live works is if I save this into, wait, that's the user library. If I save it into, here we go, an external folder that's in the places, if something has external samples referenced to it, so like a Max for Live device or WAV files or whatever, Live has to create an entire Live project for it to store those samples so that Live knows where to find them when you load up this ADG file. For me personally, I just found that really annoying, having to dig through, especially if you've got like lots of instruments. Like I know I've got a bunch of synth presets that I made that work with samples. So like every single one of these presets has samples linked to it, and that would get super messy really quickly. So you can definitely use custom folders here to organize things. I just find the user library makes things a bit cleaner. I'm a little bit obsessive about keeping things neat and tidy, so it does make a big difference, I think. But that's the reason, really, is the user library, just the way the user library works, it kind of makes it easier for collecting things together, if that makes sense. So let's see what else we got here. How do you use your default session? So that's a very kind of good question that relates to workflow. It's something that's changed recently in Live 11 because now, previously in Live 10, that was something you set up in the preferences, but now in Live 11, you can go to the File menu and save Live Set as default set. To be honest, the default set now with the way that Live has kind of exposed templates as well. So this is another big kind of workflow thing. And this is something new in Live 11, the way that templates work. The default set becomes less useful because before, well, it's still kind of useful. The default set is like a good starting point, something that you use quite frequently. For me, I really like having a blank default set. So you'll see if I start a new Live set, it's basically just going to be completely blank with one thing loaded up. So I've just got a blank slate to start completely fresh, which is just my personal preference. But if you find that every time you start a new session, you're always loading up the same drum rack or the same instrument or the same channel strip or whatever it is that you're loading up, it's going to save you a bunch of time if you just set up a default set. So the way the default set works is anytime you go File, New, it's the Live set that loads up. And the way you save that now in Live 11 is you literally just go File, Save Live Set as default set, and whatever your current configurations are, whatever tracks you've got loaded, samples that are in there, arrangement view, session view, on the master track, doesn't matter. It'll save them as a live set, and that'll always open up when you hit File, New Live Set. But so now what's new in Live 11 is that you can also do that with templates. And the difference between templates is, and the default set is that templates aren't going to load up when you hit File New. Templates will load up, you can load from this templates folder. And so if let's make something, just whatever, I'll load up a device here. If I go and I save this as a template, save live set as template, let's call it limiter. You can see that it actually saves that into the user library because my custom templates is another folder that's here in the user library. But now in Live 11, it also shows up in this template folder here. So there's limiter. And if I want to load this up, so if I go like File, New Live Set, you'll see it's going to load up my default set that is nothing. But if I want to load up a template with that limiter, I load it from here and it loads it up. The difference here between just like having a normal set is you'll notice this is still untitled. It's not a saved set. So it's actually created a completely new project just using this kind of preset setting. So this is really useful if you like work in a particular genre or you work in different genres. Maybe you have a particular setup for drum and bass versus dubstep, or maybe you have a setup for when you're recording voiceovers versus doing film scores, etc. So that's what kind of templates are for. If you're not on Live 11 yet, you can actually still use templates. So this was kind of a hidden feature before. And the way it works is in the user library, so again, user library, super handy, is it wasn't created by default before, but you could actually just right click and create a new folder in the user library called templates. And it would work in exactly the same way. Any project that you saved into that templates folder would function as a template. So if you're still using Live 10, you can still work with templates and you can save them. Just create your own custom folder called templates, save your live templates in there, and then you just double click to load them from here and it'll load that up as a template. Okay, what else have we got? A quick question not related to organization. How to freeze and flatten a mono track. I know I can export in mono. Yeah. So not related to organization, but I'll just answer that quickly, is you can't really, unfortunately. It's kind of a bit of a weird way that Live works, is for whatever reason they've decided to make it this way, is that every live track is stereo. And that doesn't really make a difference like in terms of mixing, because if you've got a mono file, even though the track is stereo, it's basically just splitting the same signal to both. But I know what you mean, where if you've got a mono audio file and you freeze and flatten because you've got some effects, it turns it into a stereo file, even if it's still mono. It's just kind of one of the weird things with how Live works. I don't know why they've done it that way, but unfortunately it just is. So the answer to that is you can't at the moment. Maybe in the future, Ableton will add mono tracks. But yeah, that's just kind of the way it is at the moment, unfortunately. So I see Juan says, I missed this again. Will you be making a video about it? Yes, I'm making a video about it right now. So this should be being recorded to YouTube. So it might not be available right away. I might go in and just kind of edit out some of the fluff in between, but it should be available to watch after the fact. So if you missed the start of the stream or you want to go over anything again, it'll be there on YouTube. Could you repeat quickly, how did you get to the user library organizer? So yeah, that is, you go to File and Manage Files. And that's going to bring up this sidebar over here, and then Manage User Library. And that's going to just scan all the files that are in your user library, and there it is. And then you can see kind of what are external files, how many files are there, if any files are missing, etc. Because the user library is actually, you'll see if I show this in Finder, it's actually just a live project. It's a special kind of live project because it's the user library. But it's basically just a live project that it works the same way as any other Ableton Live project. There's actually also quite useful to know because you can obviously back this up. So if you've got like a Time Machine backup or however you do your backups, this is just a folder. So like if your computer crashes, you can always just copy this folder directly back in here. You can also save your user library in a different location if you want. So in Live's preferences, under library, location of user library, you can set this to a custom location. So I know some people have their user library on Dropbox, for example, so it's like always backed up. You can set a custom user library location. You could even have, like I've even seen people who have multiple user libraries. So like if you're working on a shared computer, for example, at a studio, you can have different user libraries for different people, but then you just, every time you load up Ableton, you just have to switch the user library to your custom user library if you want to. So that's possible as well. Sarah says, I am wondering how you work with importing loops or samples of different sample rates or bit rates. You just don't worry about it, because Live kind of deals with that for you. So the way Live is built, it just works with any sample rate or bit depth and just converts them on the fly. So you could have a single set that has files that are 44.1, 48, 96, 24-bit, 16-bit, 8-bit if you want, and Live just kind of works with them in real time and sort of converts them on the fly, which is pretty handy. So important to know, though, that the sample rate that your project will always run at is in the audio tab, so the in-out sample rate. So that's like if you're exporting, or the sample rate that you're actually hearing, and that's the sample rate that everything will be converted to on the fly. So if for whatever reason, I don't know, maybe all your samples are, your samples are all at 44.1, maybe you'll want to set this to 44.1 so Live doesn't have to do that conversion on the fly. But yeah, usually you can just kind of set this to whatever, and Live will handle that for you in the background. And then in terms of bit depth, the only time that's relevant is when you are recording something new. So the bit depth doesn't really relate because Live is a 64-bit engine. It's always processing in 64-bit when it's processing effects and things. Or I think it's, I'm not entirely sure how that works, but I think it like processes at 32-bit. I don't know, I'm not a computer scientist, but this bit depth is only relevant when you are recording new files in directly in Live. This basically just says when I record something new in Live, or when I resample or something like that, this is the bit depth and file type that I want to use, and it will also record at whatever sample rate you have set here. But if you're importing stuff from elsewhere, it doesn't really matter. You can drag whatever in. How often do you use the search function in the browser? Quite frequently, I guess, because sometimes it's just a quicker way to get to something specific. But honestly, with this setup that I've got here, not that much. Usually it's only if I am like looking for something in a pack that I maybe haven't saved yet, or I'm looking for a very specific sample. To be honest, not that often, because I just kind of have everything organized anyway. But it is a relatively decent search. It could be improved, but it's not so bad. Eric, yes, this will be uploaded to YouTube. As I mentioned, I think I'm going to just kind of edit it a bit after the fact and clear out some of the fluff, and then I'll upload it to YouTube. Rais says, symlinks/junctions are your best friend in music production. I'm not entirely sure what that is. What if the places aren't external folders, just folders inside your user library? Yeah, that should work, I think. So like if you've got, if I go show in Finder and I go into Studio and I just have effects. Yeah, there you go. So I guess that's a way to bypass the collections. So that's cool. Hadn't thought about that before. So yeah, you could do that. You could have a whole bunch of custom folders that you set up in there, and then you don't have to use collections. So that's handy. So you still then have to kind of use the user library to organize things when you save them in there. And again, that's still useful just because of the way that it collects files. But yeah, you could just then load those folders from the user library into there. You might even, I wonder if you can just do that. Yeah, there you go. You can just drag it straight out of here. So that's kind of cool. Nice one, Ben. I like the idea of the explore folder. Yeah, the explore folder is pretty fun. I quite like that. Like if I'm working on a session and I'm like, oh, I just want to try something new or experiment a bit, I just head to the explore folder and try like a new device that I haven't tried. The building folder is basically like where if I'm working on any racks, because some of you, I'm sure you might be familiar with the racks and things that I put out. If I'm working on something and it's like in the process of being built, I just save like the work in progress of it to the building folder. Meta Mind Music says, curious how you went about choosing your collections categories. I don't know really. That just kind of was the categories of things that I wanted to use. So for example, like instruments is like the raw, so basically not presets. So things like simpler, sampler, operator, etc. So instruments is where I go to when I'm wanting to build a sound from scratch, whereas sounds is presets, so like pre-configured presets that might use some of the instruments, but I know that I'm going to sounds when I'm looking for like a very specific sound as opposed to building something from scratch. I liked having my drums and percussion stuff separate. Then effects, MIDI effects, grooves. I've actually only got one thing in there, so I could probably change grooves to something else. But it just so happened that the 7 kind of worked for what I needed. It depends on your own preferences and your own setup, really. How do you organize your drums so you can go through samples quickly while playing a MIDI clip with a beat and, let's say, choose the right hi-hat? So that is a topic for another video, but if you go, there's already tons on YouTube, but if you search for the last drum rack you'll ever need, I'll show you briefly. So I've got a drum rack here, which basically it's set up with racks so that each pad has a sample selector that I can just scroll through a bunch of different samples. So snares, etc. And so you can have a beat playing and then just flick through samples. So if you just search on YouTube for the last drum rack you'll ever need, you'll definitely find videos about how to set this up. It uses the sampler and some kind of complicated sampler stuff that I won't get into now. Do you use external drives for the user library? I don't personally. I've got enough space on my hard drive, and generally the internal drive loads things faster anyway, but you certainly can. You just obviously have to make sure that those drives are always connected when you want to work with it. I definitely know people who have their user library on external drives. Instead of moving things inside a user folder, could we use a symlink? So that's a bit beyond me. I'm not entirely sure what a symlink is, to be honest. So I can't answer that one. But I'll look into it, though. Wayne, yes, this will be able to view at a later date. Tips for archiving, saving projects on an external hard drive. What is the best to avoid missing media files? Yeah, so the bit that I went through at the end about collect all and save, and particularly with this this manage files option, basically anytime I'm saving something to kind of archive, I just go manage project and I set all these external files to collect, whether it's from a factory pack or a user library, because I just know that when I come back to that session in the future, maybe I've got a different set of packs installed, maybe I've changed things around in my user library. The safest way to know that that session is always going to work how you want it to is to just do this collect all and save everything into the project and then archive that whole project file. Okay, I'm going to go through a couple more questions and then start thinking about wrapping up. What do you do when you feel out of passion for experimenting? Many things. To be honest, the last couple months I've been feeling a bit out of passion for music, and so I'm just going to do a little side shout out here. If anyone is interested, I've actually recently started a Discord group for this exact reason, as I was kind of not really feeling super excited about music over the last few months. And so what I've done to kind of get my inspiration back is look to other mediums. So I've recently been doing a lot of visual art, animation, VJing, NFTs. So I've started a Discord group called the Digital Creators Club. You can find that by going to elephant.io. Maybe I'll just drop this in the chat. elephant.io/creators-club. And that will take you to the Discord if you're interested in joining that. And that's a place to basically just chat with other people who are working in different disciplines, animation, writing, film, music, whatever it is, and kind of cross-pollinate ideas, learn from each other, share things. It's super fun. So definitely check that out. That helps, I find, is just trying something different if you're getting stuck. Taking a break is really useful as well if you're getting stuck. Is just give yourself some time away, whether that's like if you're in the middle of a session, just take like an hour break, or take a day break or a week break or whatever it is that you need, and just do something different for a while and then come back and try something new. Cool. So I've just shared that link in the chat. Okay, I'll do a couple more questions. When working with two samples that are in different keys, how would you tune them to work? I'm not going to answer that now because we could get into some complex stuff. What I'm going to say instead is if there are any other topics for live streams that you want to see, is head to my website, elephant.io, which I'm sure you might be familiar with. There's a contact page on there, and just send me an email with things that you'd like to look at in future live streams, because this is the first sort of live stream that I'm doing on the Elephant channel, and I definitely want to do a couple more. Well, more than a couple more, hopefully. So if there's any things that you want to look at in more detail in future live streams, then let me know. Lewis says the download links at Elephant are not working for the free stuff. Cool. Thanks for letting me know. I will check that out. Even after logging in. Oh, okay. I'll definitely check that out. Let's do one more question. So I'm just scrolling through to find a question. Lots of discussion about symlinks. Do you do Max? Okay, last question is, can you recommend some great Max for Live plugins? I remember one that was like a track channel, but can't remember the name. As for Max for Live plugins, just check out on my YouTube channel. I've done a couple of videos now where I basically go through some of my kind of favorite Max for Live devices and Max for Live devices that I use pretty regularly. So yeah, just check that out, because honestly, like everything that I think is worth sharing, I've kind of shared there already. So definitely check that out. Cool. So yeah, I think I'm going to wrap up there. Thanks so much, everybody, for coming out. I hope it was useful. Just the last thing to say is that if you've enjoyed this, I always really appreciate your support. So head to elephant.io. Check out some of the Ableton Live packs that are there. I've got merch on there as well, t-shirts, stickers, etc. There's a link in the description as well to a page that has a whole bunch of other ways that you can support if you want, like things like affiliate links and donations and stuff like that. So if you enjoyed this, I'd really appreciate that, because it definitely helps keep these things going. But yeah, thanks so much for coming, everyone, and hopefully I will catch you soon.